welcome to my channel. Calling it Polynormal for now. My name is Sam Smith. I want to introduce you to Blender. I've compiled a course of basically it's making a rock, but it includes like sculpting, texture mapping, procedural textures, and a host of other things. I'm trying to decide whether or not like what skill level this is going to be for. And I think it's probably introductory, beginner. So I'll be going through some quick intro to Blender. The learning curve for Blender is often quite steep, depending on what you're trying to do. Blender is a huge program. I mean, it covers everything from compositing. There's even nonlinear video editing. 3D animation, of course, 3D modeling. You can use it for game development, asset creation, motion tracking for VFX. It does simulations. It almost does everything. I mean, it's an amazing open source program. The course will include programs like GIMP and Darktable for processing photographs that you take with your DSLR camera or with your phone. Both of those programs are also open source, so you can download them and use them for free, just like Blender. That's what's wonderful about Blender and many of these other applications. GIMP is a photo editing or video editing. It's a raster image editing or raster image editing software. So it's like Photoshop. Yeah, so you use GIMP a lot of the time for editing images that you use in Blender. It's pretty nice. Some people use Krita, but I'm just more comfortable with GIMP. You can use either one. You can also use Photoshop. I mean, it's not like you just need something to edit images with. I'm also going to be using what's the program's name? It's called PureRef. It's an open source program. I think it's open source. It's free to use anyway. It allows you to compile a set of images on your desktop in a window to use as a reference. So we're going to be using references to make these rocks. But for the first video, I would like to introduce, well, of course, myself, the channel. The channel's primarily, well, it's Blender content, the channel, really. But the purpose of the channel is, like I said, to introduce everybody who wants to know more about Blender to Blender. And if you haven't used Blender or even heard of it before, we'll go through the details of getting it, installing it, some basic like navigation through Blender. It can be frustrating if you don't know how to use a complex program like this initially. So the more intermediate, advanced users might find it a little annoying to have to watch all this content again, but you don't have to watch it again. You can just skip through it. So we will get to it. We need to download Blender first. I will put a link somewhere, on the image. So the next part of this, we'll download Blender, we'll install it. Debating whether you need PureRef. You do need GIMP though, so we'll go and get GIMP as well and install it. And then we'll go through some like basic a tour of Blender as it were for the first video, and then after that we'll get into actually making the content. And I'll show you the well, the image you saw before was the hopefully the result of this whole course. So I don't really know how many episodes it'll be. It'd probably be like, I don't know, like 6 or 7. I'm hoping to produce them once a week. So we'll see how that goes. And well, enjoy yourself, and I hope you learned something. All right. So first we need to install Blender because this is a course about how to use Blender. So the current version is 3.2.1. I use 3.1. There's a few small differences between the two versions, but nothing that would change almost anything, for using the UI or anything else. So we're going to you can look through the site. There's a lot of really cool stuff here, like, what kind of things are going on with Blender in the future, the kinds of things to be excited about in the upcoming versions of Blender, different things about just about Blender in general, like famous people who are quite good at the program. They've got some really cool demo videos as well. So we're going to go to Blender Download, and you get, of course, whichever distribution works with your operating system. Linux uses a snap system now, so you just install it into a folder, or you unpack it from the tar file into a folder, I suppose, and it runs from the executable inside the folder, which is quite cool. Windows is always the same. You know, you run the executable and it scatters it across your computer in mysterious dimensions. Macintosh, I don't know, I've never used it before. So once you've got this downloaded, we'll move on to the next part. Okay, so now that you've downloaded Blender and you've installed it on your operating system, you start Blender and you're greeted with generally a splash screen. You click on New Scene and you're confronted with this kind of overwhelming kind of, what do I do from here? Some of you already know what you do. You might have used programs like this before. You can just skip through this. There might be some information you'd use, but for anybody who's confronted by this and doesn't know what to do, I'll run through the basic controls for navigating through most of Blender for the rest of this video. So the scene, I want you to press A and then X. A selects everything, X deletes. Okay, so now I want you to go up here to Add, Mesh, Cube. You've just added a cube. A cube is obviously geometry. If you go down here to the bottom right corner, before you select or do anything else, don't click anything else, you have dimensions or properties for the cube that you've added. So you can change this. You can change its location. This just changes the primitive, which is what you just added, a cube. Changes it before setting it into the scene. Now, to navigate your scene, use the middle mouse button. I think that's default. So pressing it down and rotating allows you to spin around your desired location. Pressing Shift and pressing the middle mouse button lets you pan. Scrolling lets you zoom. So now that you have that, the delete button or the period button will let you focus on the object you've selected. I have it set to a mouse button. If you press Tab, this is looking at geometry and how you interact with it. If you press Tab, you'll go into edit mode for your geometry. This allows you to select individual vertices and move them. Now you can select the widget, the move widget, to do that, and that will move it on whichever plane you've selected. This is a Y exclusion plane, so this would be the Z axis, the ZX plane. The same goes for the Z exclusion plane and the X exclusion plane. So we can press Control Z, undo those edits. If we select two and we move them simultaneously, I'm going to press G, which is a shortcut for move. It'll move them as expected. But what's happening here is that G, when you press it and you manipulate the geometry, it's going to move in a planar fashion compared to your view. So you notice it didn't quite, if I move like to here, and then I press G and move it back to what looks like a cube. Now if I move back, it's obviously not straight. So I'm going to undo those edits. So now there's a shortcut to change from, there's a shortcut and there's modes up here, top right next to edit mode. You can click on edge mode to interface or to select individual edges to move or operate on. And you can select faces to do the same with faces. There's a shortcut for that. It's 1, 2, 3. Holding down Shift allows you to select multiple instances simultaneously. Control apparently does that too. Doesn't do it in object mode. So if I was to go back to object mode, I can change the number of cubes that I have in my scene by pressing Shift D. This will duplicate your cube, and it will create a separate instance of your cube, so they won't be linked together in any way. If you press Alt D, that's not the same. So if I go back into edit mode with Alt D and I select vertex mode, I can change this and they're linked. So Alt D lets you instance your cube. Control D lets you copy your cube. So we're going to undo that and undo that. So now you've got two cubes. Let's go over what you can see on your screen here. That's the fun part of navigating your 3D viewport. There's one other part. Well, there's more than one, but is you press Z and you click on wireframe. This will give you a wireframe view similar to what you see in edit mode. In solid in edit mode, what you can do is go up here on the top and you click this little toggle here called X-ray, and this will let you see through your geometry in solid view in edit mode. So what you can do is you can go up here in the top and you can say, oh, I'd want to look at wireframe, solid, shaded, which allows you to see the textures that are mapped to your object. This has no textures mapped to it without any ray tracing. This is a ray tracing mode, so this is going to use cycles to imitate or to show you a rough example of what it'll look like when it's rendered. Once we've mentioned cycles, so I'm going to go to the render properties, and I'm going to make sure cycles is selected instead of Eevee. Eevee is a faster system or faster rendering engine to use, but it doesn't use ray tracing, so it doesn't look as nice and it's not as exact as cycles. For the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to use cycles. You want to go down here, and if you have a compatible graphics adapter, you're going to want to use GPU compute. How you know you have a compatible graphics adapter is you go up to Edit, Preferences, and under System, you're going to notice CUDA or optics. And if there's anything to check under either of those other than your processor, then you have a compatible GPU compute system. So make sure that optics, if you have it, is checked. CUDA is a second best. Make sure that's checked for your graphics card. And if neither of those show up, I think AMD, this is for NVIDIA cards, AMD has its own systems. If neither of those show up, then you're going to have to leave it on CPU compute. CPU compute's a little slower, but it still works. It has, I'll go into that later, for the amount of memory you can use or allocate for textures in your 3D scene will be different depending on whether you use GPU or CPU compute, but we'll go into that a little later. So your window here is your 3D interface. It's what you see, how you operate, how you perform transforms and change the thing that you're trying to make. This is a outliner. It shows you what's in your scene. You can organize it by using collections. Collections are like folders. So I'm going to add a new collection, and this is inside the current collection. So I can change its location, nesting it inside of other collections. I can drag my items inside of it or drag them outside of it. You can hide entire collections, or you can prevent them from rendering. You can also do that with individual geometry or objects themselves. And now this is an object, and it doesn't have anything linked to it, anything parented to it. So if I was to select a second object, you can see, I'm going to make a third one just for the sake of it, and a fourth. So I right click. Because I have right click selected, you might be different, depends on how you set Blender up. You can either use left click or right click as a selection tool. There's one that's lighted differently. That's the selected object for the group of selected objects. So sometimes you'll have things that want to apply their settings to multiple objects, or you want to apply settings to multiple objects. Like let's say these are all different x-axis distances, right? So if I select all of these, and then the last one is the active selected one, I can then go up to location and X, right click, and then I can say copy all to selected or copy single to selected. And that will copy, single to selected would be the single cardinal coordinates of this location set to all of the selected items from the active selected. It might not make a lot of sense, but eventually it will. So that being said, selecting objects works very similar to any other program. Shift allows you to select multiple objects and change the active object. Control doesn't do anything in object mode. If I go in here, I can select Shift, or I can Control to select different ones. It's very similar to any other application like file browsers. Now we're going to talk about the window. These window settings are pretty straight. They're interesting because they all can be anything. So this little token or this little icon up here means that I can change all of these to viewports, and I can change their settings, and I can bring up the side or toolbar menu. They're all the same. They're all identical. They all have their own settings for the type of display that you want them to do or want them to show. But you can also move them around. So like let's change this back so I know what I'm doing. Outliner and properties. But if you want more, you can just make another one. You go up here, a little X appears, click and hold, drag. You drag across or you drag down. Very simple. You drag up into one that you've made before and it joins it back, joins it back, joins it back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split it, and I'm going to change the location of the 3D cursor to demonstrate something. And then I'm going, when you add items to a scene, the location that the items appear in from the add context or add menu is the 3D cursor. So I'm going to add a camera. I used spacebar. I set up dynamic context menu from a spacebar. There's also an object context menu if you use W. If I go into edit mode and I'm on a face and I use W, it'll show me all of the context information or context settings I can use on faces. It's a context specific menu. So there's multiple ways of accessing the same information in Blender. You can go and add, go down to camera, and it's added a camera, but it looks like it's not here. I'm going to center on object. Again, it looks like it's not here. But if we look up here in the collections, there's a camera here. Okay, so what's going on? Well, it's too small, at least to see visually. If you zoom in real close, you can see it there. Well, it's clipping through the box too, but you can see it there. It's just really super small. So we're going to go to the side, select the camera from the outliner, because it's probably going to be very difficult to select it in the scene, especially since it's clipping through a box. We're going to go over here to camera, and we're going to go down to viewport display, and we're going to change it to something that's not super tiny. When at all possible, you should be working in real-world units. If you want to make a box that's 10 centimeters large, then you should make a box that says down here it's 10 centimeters large. We're going to quickly go into that because it's necessary to know to progress. So under, remember where it is. It's under, there's an option under, so I think it's scene, yeah, here it is. So I'm using metric units, and the unit scale is 1. So that means 1 meter is 1 Blender unit. Blender has its own internal units, and it converts to other units. So if I wanted to change this to imperial or metric, different types, I could change the scale If I change it to 0.1, suddenly everything gets smaller according to the dimensions, even though nothing's changed size. So it's all represented in Blender units, but it's showing you the measurements converted into real world units. So I would prefer to work at a 1 unit for 1 meter, which is a pretty decent size. So now that I'm working at 1 meter for 1 unit, I know that my box will be exactly 11 centimeters if I say it's 11 centimeters here. It's useful because if you drop a sculpture of a human or something into your scene, suddenly you don't want the scene to look strange or distorted. It's easier to figure out what scale everything is supposed to be at. The one thing you have to notice is the scale here. If I press S, it's another form of transform, but in object mode, it scales the object up and it preserves its original scale and gives you a multiplier here. So it's currently 1.8. So if I change this to 2, it'll give me 22 centimeters. So it's multiplying on the original. This can mess up some calculations a little bit. So the way you change this or set it or bake the scale in, it works this way with rotations as well. Let's say I rotate it 50 degrees. So the way you bake this in is you go to transform, apply, scale. You're going to apply the scale to the original object, and now it's baked in. You can do this with rotation and position as well. The reason why you might want to keep your rotation here and not just bake it in every time is because you can go up here to local, and it'll actually allow you to transform an object along its own rotational axis. So it'll always transform it based off of, so if I went and I baked in, apply rotation, what happens now is that even though it's set to local, it's still using the global coordinate system because both the local and global coordinate system match because it's baked the rotation in. Now we want to demonstrate something that might be more interesting, which is how do you get a pretty image, like a rendered image or ray traced image? Well, that's pretty straightforward. Once you have cycles set up, just make sure it's set up as cycles, GPU compute, and you go up here to viewport shading. Believe it or not, that's ray traced. It doesn't look like it, but it is. The reason it doesn't look very good is there's no light. There's very little light. There's scene light, but it's just coming from like a gray background. You can also press Z, solid material preview. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a light. So we go up here to add light, point. So now we have a point. And as you can see, it is ray traced. Or there's very little difference between ray tracing at this point and any other system. There's not enough complexity to the scene. So this is a point. It's not particularly interesting because it's just a bunch of boxes. We're going to set up the camera so we can see what it looks like through the camera. There is a viewport camera, as it were, which is what I'm currently looking through, and there's a render camera. These cameras are what you render the scene as. Your camera is always, it's like a film camera. You're going to take a picture. It's the same principle as rendering. You're going to look through the camera lens. It's going to have settings on it, including depth of field. So what you could do, well, first of all, we're going to show you what it looks like through the camera. Over here, we're going mouse in the viewport you're interested in changing, press 0. That's the shortcut for looking through the camera. It's not looking the way we want it to look. So if I just rotate the viewport, it moves away from the camera. What I want to do is I want the camera to look exactly here. So one way I could do that, and a lot of times it's useful to do this, is you look through the viewport in one, or the camera in one viewport, and in the other viewport you change its direction by rotation. So we can rotate by Y since it's set to local, and then we can rotate by Z. Rotate Z, and then we can rotate X. Now this achieves the result, but it's very slow and unwieldy. So what we can also do is go in here and look at the scene the way we want to look at it using our viewport camera. And then we can select view, viewport, view, align view, align active camera to view. And suddenly we have an active camera that's looking in the direction that we want it to look. Well, let's say I wanted to adjust this. If I move, again, it just moves off the camera. I can change that. I go in view on this tab here on the side, and I'm going to see what it says here, camera to view. I'm going to check that box. And now when I move the camera, or the view, the camera sticks to it, which is quite useful. So we're going to set it there. We're going to turn this off. Now we'll leave it off. So it's it's obviously lacking a certain amount of interest at this point because it's just boxes. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a different kind of light source. This is a point light, and if you want to adjust the settings for the point light, you select the point light and you go down here in your editor types and you select light, point light. You can change it in the editor types like spotlight, area light. You can change its strength, a bunch of different things. What we want to do is we want to add in a world light. So in the natural world, everything scatters light and in effect almost becomes light emitters. So we're going to select here, we're going to select environment texture, and we're going to open one. We're going to go in here, HDR, CC0. We're also going to select this one. So this is called an HDRI. HDRIs are high dynamic range image. They are designed with the ability to project or to represent light values for their pixels when you use them that way. The scene here is what basically that's what it's doing. Is it's projecting light from all of the, it's sampling the pixel values and projecting light from the locations. You can see a little bit of green from the grass, you can see blue from the sky. It gives you a very realistic environment texture. Now that that's done, we're going to look at rendering. So if we go back in scene, this is the size of image that will be rendered. So right now it's set to HD, it was 1920 by 1080. So if we change this, you can see that the camera on the side there actually changes its dimensions. This here will change the scale that it's rendered at. So usually you render your preview scenes before you've ironed out all of the way it's supposed to look at like a lower percentage because it takes more time to render a larger scene. More rays have to be traced. So now to render, you press F12 and you wait for it to render. The sample size, that's the, how would you explain it? That's the detail that's being rendered. So as it's a simple scene, it won't take that long. The memory used is specific. It's kind of important. The HDRI added to the scene is quite large. It's an 8K image. So the reason why this memory is using this much is because that file that I added is being used in the VRAM memory to render the scene. So if you have VRAM memory that's, if you have 6 gigs of VRAM on your graphics card, then you can only add a maximum of 6 gigs, probably less than that, to your scene before Blender will say it's out of memory. The same goes for CPU memory and system memory. A CPU render and system memory. So I'm going to do the same scene, except I'm going to remove the HDRI image and I'm going to replace it with something that's not fuchsia. The fuchsia color comes from Blender not being able to find a file to place in this image slot. So you end up with, it's showing you that it doesn't know where to find the image. So we're going to click on environment texture and we're going to click on gradient. Now it's not showing anything here just yet, because a gradient is essentially just a gradient, but we're going to render the same image and we're going to see that the memory usage, the peak and the current memory usage are dramatically lower. The other image is quite large. So that's something to keep in mind when you're building your scene. It won't be important for this particular tutorial because we're not going to be making a lot of image heavy assets. Unless, of course, you have a very small machine. But other than that, it's very unlikely you'll have a machine that's incapable of rendering a certain number of items. And I believe that paves the way for the next video, where we should be covering sculpting. And yeah, we're going to sculpt rocks in the next video. So I'll see you then, and stay tuned for more interesting content.